This is Tal Unbound, the English language podcast of Tel Aviv University. Please welcome your host, Ido Aharoni, Tel Aviv University's graduate, member of the Board of Governors, lecturer, writer, and veteran diplomat.
Welcome to Tal Unbound. I'm Ido Aharoni, your host, and today it is my great pleasure and privilege to host Professor Alon Tal. Thank you for taking the time to join us in our studio. Let me just briefly say to our audience that Alon Tal in Israel is a legendary figure in the field of the environment, protecting the environment, legally and otherwise. He was born in New Jersey, moved to Israel in 1980. He's the chairman of the School of Public Policy since 2017, with a brief period where he went to serve as a member of the Knesset. He was a member of the 24th Knesset. And he is an expert on many things that are related to the mega task of protecting the environment. But among other things, he founded over 10 different entities in Israel, and is most notably Teva V'din, the Israel Union for Environmental Defense, which he founded in 1990, the Arava Institute for Environment Studies in 1996, Israel Union for Environmental Defense, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about all those great initiatives. Welcome again to our podcast.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our listeners and people who are with us today.
Yes, and I must say that the environment is an issue that comes up in many of our podcasts, whether we're talking about medicine, public health, or even defense. So the environment is on our minds in a very big way. And so before we jump into the subject itself, we always like to begin with some personal questions. You were born in North Carolina, in Raleigh, right?
I grew up in Raleigh and Durham, North Carolina, right?
So what made you connect with Israel, and how did this connection come about?
Well, there's two questions which I guess arise from that. How did I connect to Israel, and how did I connect to the environment? And I guess I have to start with my parents. You could say I'm a second-generation environmentalist. My father is an analytical chemist, and when as a child, he was in charge of the laboratories which did all the early analysis for water and air pollution for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. And Friday night dinner conversations would be something like, and I remember one in particular, the Mississippi River is the cause of New Orleans' high cancer rate. There's 700% greater incidence of bladder cancer in New Orleans than the rest of the U.S. We know it's because of the water there. I just got 70 samples, and they expect me to find the toxic substances. I imagine that affected me. Also, the environment. There's a famous expression by Chernyakhovsky that humans are the result of their physical environment. And I grew up in North Carolina. It was over 60% forested then. I think it's still largely a green state. And as a kid who had a lot of energy, my mother would just kick me out, and I'd spend a lot of time in the trees and the woodlands of that area, and that also affected me. And I grew up in a youth movement, Young Judea, which is a Zionist youth movement founded by Hadassah, supported by Hadassah those days. Today it's independent, and it was a very, very influential factor in my life. Summer camps, and eventually I was on the national exec. I was in charge of education when I was 16 for the youth movement. So it became very clear at a young age that it would be unimaginable to live in an age when there was a third Jewish Commonwealth and that I wouldn't be part of this incredible adventure. And I'm delighted that Israel, with all the bumps along the way, has not disappointed. It's still the best way for me to spend my life.
And so you moved here in 1980. When you moved to Israel, were you aware of the keen interest that the Zionist leadership had in North America, especially in the water management aspect of the environment, the TVA? Ben-Gurion was fascinated with that.
I was unaware of that, although later when I wrote a book called Pollution in the Promised Land, I went a deep dive into water policy and water history and learned a lot about Ben-Gurion. He was very interested in desalination before anybody even heard the term, and gave the water, those days we called it the water commissioner, gave him a piece of paper with the number of the number one desal expert at UCLA in the U.S. He said, talk to this guy, we need desalination here. And it would take another 30, 40 years until the technology caught up in the public awareness. But no, I was not. I would say that I came actually when I was 17 after high school. My parents, I wanted to stay, but you needed your parents' permission to go to the Army. So they said, come back, do a year of college. I was at UNC, and then I realized I could finish. So I came around my 20th birthday, went right into the Army, which in retrospect was a very fortuitous decision because I had at some point I was in the paratroopers, a very, very tall, skinny, brilliant, and brave what we call company commander. His name was Benny Gantz, with whom I remained in contact, and it was thanks to that connection that I made it to the Knesset. And I saw him yesterday, celebrated his birthday. But the fact of the matter is that I came here to Israel with a strong impulse that I needed to make a difference, that I came to Israel, we used to call it in the youth movement, in Chalutzik Aliyah, to be a pioneering presence, not just to come here and, take a job as a scuba dive instructor in Eilat, but really to try to make this country the kind of, we used to call it a light into the nations that we know it can be and should be.
And you met Benny Gantz in the Nachal Brigade, I'm assuming.
That's correct.
Were you connected to any of the kibbutzim?
Yes, I came originally, I was adopted. I was a lone soldier. I was adopted at kibbutz Mordechai at the very north of the country. But in the middle of my service, a friend of mine, a close friend with whom I had played a lot of music, said, listen, you should come down to kibbutz Keturah, which was the young Judea kibbutz. And there was a rock band there I wanted to play with. And so during the middle of my service, I came there, and I was supposed to have spent 6 months doing what they call shalat, or agricultural service, but it was the time of the First Lebanon War, 1982, and so much of that time I spent in preparing for the war and then actually in Lebanon. But still, it was enough of a connection with Keturah that my wife and I moved there in 1990 and spent a decade there. All of our children were born there, so that was a lucky also contribution of the military to my life.
So when did you officially become a full-time environmentalist?
That's a really good question. I can tell you when the first impulse was. I was hitchhiking when I was in the Army in the Carmel. In those days, soldiers got where they needed to get through hitchhiking. And I was astonished at the amount of litter. And again, I grew up in the United States, and my father was very environmentally minded. There had been a lot of beautification campaigns. I was the small child when Lady Bird Johnson used to try to beautify America and stop all the littering. But I was appalled, and I said, how is it that, I'm here fighting for this country. I know how much people are committed to it, and yet we are so insouciantly making it ugly and making it dirty. I didn't have a lot of environmental studies behind me, and I was, in retrospect, regretful that I hadn't studied chemistry, which is very helpful when you're an environmentalist. You could make up for it. But instead, I'd studied political science and economics when I was at the University of North Carolina. So eventually, after I finished the Army, I went to law school, and that's a whole other story, but that was, in retrospect, also a fortuitous decision. But I realized I needed to get a stronger scientific grounding, so I ended up going to the Harvard School of Public Health, which at the time was the best place I found that environmental sciences were being taught.
When you saw that the Israelis really don't care, like they were littering the nature, and I remember myself when my father was a tour guide and one of the founding members of the Society for the Preservation of Natural Life in Israel, and he used to drive him crazy. He used to pick up the garbage himself. My father used to say, it's a sign of low culture. He was like you, he was appalled by it. To what do you attribute that behavior? It hasn't really changed, by the way.
Well, I want to say, in defense of my countrymen, I believe that the people who leave garbage in Israel is a very, very small percentage. We're talking about 2 or 3, but 1 or 2 people can make a big difference. We all know the Giuliani theory of order, that once you take off a hubcap of a car, they're going to strip everything off of it. That's why you don't let any windows get broken and any graffiti, because there's sort of a zero threshold. And places that are clean tend to stay clean in Israel. But having said that, there are all kinds of theories. I once heard Uri Marinov, who used to be the founding Director General of the Ministry of Environment, say that he thought it had something to do with the Jewish mentality from Europe. Because if you recall, what was sort of the norm there in the shtetl, at least the stereotype, was that the public spaces were frightening places. That's where the Cossacks were. So the houses themselves were immaculate, clean. Jews have all kinds of rituals of staying clean and pure. But outside, that was for everybody else. And he said, if you go in an apartment building in Israel at the time, you can find immaculate houses, but the stairways and the stairwells in the public areas will be garbage because that's not there. And this is a classic psychological problem in the field. It's called the tragedy of the commons. Even on a kibbutz, and I was in a phenomenal kibbutz for 10 years, you would find more trash in the public spaces than people's houses, because somehow that was somebody else's problem, something that belongs to everybody but ultimately nobody. But I think that there might be something there. I do think there have been some areas where we've seen improvement in people's commitment to cleanliness, but every so often you find that a area is totally neglected, and we need to do better.
Which is a beautiful segue to my next question, which we discussed before we started the podcast. So there's a feeling among us observers and analysts of Israeli society that the environment is not a top-of-mind issue for the Israeli public. And certainly not for the Israeli political system. Before I left New York, there was a climate summit in New York, and 165 countries were represented. The United States was represented by President Obama. The Israeli government, not only that the Prime Minister didn't show up, they decided to send the Minister of the Environment, at the time was Avi Gabay, last minute. And basically sent a very strong message to the rest of the world: we don't care about the environment. It's not a top of mind. To what do you attribute that? Do you agree with that?
Well, first of all, empirically, I can confirm your intuition. We have many surveys where people rank those issues which are important to them. I would say Israelis on the whole, across the spectrum, and this is something which cuts across all of the different tribes. So amongst ultra-Orthodox, I've done surveys, and they love nature. And the Arabs, if you look at who the highest percentage of Israeli citizens who visit the JNF forest, it's Arabs, because they don't have nice parks in their cities. So we all love nature, but we have other priorities which somehow seem to dominate our awareness, and the discourse is very, very much, anybody who wants to make this a priority is considered a little bit of a tree hugger, a little bit of a nut. I'm lucky to be in a political party which has a chair who thinks there needs always to be somebody who thinks about that. And I can say that, at least from my perspective, when I was in the Knesset, I found that it was very, very easy to find partners on the other side of the aisle, so to speak. I won an award. There's a sort of an internet magazine in this country called Shakuf, but basically gave me an award as the outstanding bipartisan legislator. And I felt like it's not that I'm such a magnificent person who builds connections. It's just that that's the environment. My number one ally, I think, in the Knesset when I was there in the environment was Gila Gamliel, who had been just stepped down as the Minister of Environment. She succeeded Gavi Gabay, or at least by a couple of people. But and she was one of those few ministers who not only was appointed the Minister of Environment, but learned and became a bit passionate about it. I would say two things on that. In the past, ever since the Ministry of Environment was established in 1989, it has been difficult to find somebody who actually wants the job. The previous Minister of Environment, Tamar Zandberg, is a rare example of somebody who came into it and wanted the job. I would love to have that job. But most people get it as a booby prize. In fact, we all remember a certain labor politician who said to Yitzhak Rabin, "Why are you punishing me by making me a Minister of the Environment?" And so we need to change that perspective. In many countries, to be in charge of an environmental ministry is an honor. And certainly as climate change becomes a more and more pressing existential challenge to society, I think the Ministry of Environment will be more important, or we should give the authorities about climate to energy or to somebody else, because we cannot afford to have a ministry which is not engaged, professional, and absolutely committed to making a difference. Israel has important environmental challenges. We are unique and in the fact that we are a sort of a Western country with developing people's demography. But most importantly, it's a heavy responsibility to have received this glorious land of Israel, the land of the Bible, and be responsible for it. And we need to leave our children and grandchildren a healthier land than we received. And right now, we're not living up to that challenge.
Now, let me ask you a question from a different angle. So obviously, Israel, given the fact that we're such a tiny piece of land with only 10.2 million people. So our ecological footprint is very small. But we could become a hub of environmental solutions. We can punch way above our weight. What needs to happen for us to be there?
Right. I just forgot one point I'd like to emphasize, and that is that although politically on the national level, the environment has always been something of an orphan and not a priority, if you look at the local level, where people aren't voting over whether or not the West Bank should be part of Israel in the future and all these complicated geopolitical challenges, there you find a strong percentage of the population who votes on environmental issues. There have been deputy mayors who came from green parties in Jerusalem, in Tel Aviv, in Haifa. Today, the deputy mayor and the largest faction is from the Greens. Across Modi'in, we had a green person, and there are green parties everywhere. So I don't think that you could say Israelis are indifferent. They're not obtuse. But unfortunately, the noise created by the Palestinian-Israeli conflict has always been so loud that it just makes the environmental issue secondary. Now, with regard to how can we punch above our weight, in some areas we already do. I think anybody who's interested seriously about water management has to look at Israel as a place where we had plenty of trial and error, but we've had to do things that nobody else did, take chances, and I think with some breathtaking successes. I think in forestry, we are planting trees in semi-arid zones where everywhere else in the world they die. We have great success in that as well. I would like to say the same thing is true about climate tech. I think we have the potential to create an economic ecosystem in that area where we bring the incredible creativity, not just to cyber challenges and cybersecurity, but also to the environmental security that we all need from a changing climate. But part of the problem, of course, is money. Finally, and during our government, I'm very proud that the Minister of Science under our party, Orit Farkash, brought 1 billion shekels to fund chadchanut, what we call innovation in the climate tech space. And there is one area where I think we already are making that kind of contribution, and that is in the food area. About 30 to 40% of the global greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. We know that if cows were a country, they would be the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases. We have to stop eating beef. But people love beef. However, creative scientists starting, actually, if we're going to throw out a word, we're at Tel Aviv, but one of the interesting things happened in the Technion. But we are finding ways to make cultured beef. In other words, ways to have the same steak that you like to eat, but not have a cow suffer and not have the huge water footprint and land footprint and the like. We see the same thing, Remilk, a marvelous company which can do the same thing in milk. And I've had their cream cheese. I hope there's not listeners there from Philadelphia who are nervous, but their cream cheese is absolutely as good as Philadelphia, only there was no cows, no suffering. And a big question is that cream cheese milchik or parva? Is it or not? Because we don't know if there's no animals involved. But these are the kinds of innovative scientific solutions which we need to do to save the planet. Because the methane emitted by a cow is so great that we just can't continue. And we know the demand for beef as countries around the world become wealthier. People want to have meat in their diet. And I have daughters who are vegans, and I love them, but I also like a good hamburger. So thank God we have Beyond, and now we have in Israel our own redesigned meat is pretty good. And these are the kinds of solutions which Israel could be part of in helping the world overcome its greatest environmental challenge.
Now, you're known in Israel for defending the environment also by using legal tools, right? Tools from the world of law. And you founded Adam Teva V'din, which I would assume translates into human nature and law.
It's a bad translation. So we used to say the Israel Union for Environmental Defense. There's a funny story. I wanted to call it that. And they said, you're just a startup organization. That's a bombastic name. So I took the name from the textbook from my law school class at Harvard about environmental law. But yeah, that's become a well-known force for good in the country, the organization.
So tell us about what brought you to establish the organization and what happened once you introduced the legal toolbox.
So I was a graduate student at Harvard. I already had a law degree from Israel at Hebrew University, and I took classes in law. And at some point, I began to become a consultant for the US EPA and an environmental organization which has headquarters in New York and Washington called NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, asked me to be on an advisory board. And I walked into their offices, started talking to them, and I said, this is what I want to do with my life. I want to create a pit bull using the legal tools. And luckily for me, Israel already had a model because the ACLU of Israel, we call, or ACRI in English, the Civil Association for Civil Rights in Israel at that time was extremely active and had was a incipient activist court to really rewrite Israel's human rights law. And we see the same thing now with the Movement for Quality Government doing the same thing. But that the Israeli court's liberal attitude towards standing creates a dynamic which is very, very, I would say it's a favorable one for the environment because, look, when you are trying to fight big polluters, they have all the cards, they have all the money. It is not a level playing field. But when you get in court, they've got a lawyer and you've got a lawyer. If you are fighting for the forces of light versus the forces of evil, you can win. And it was astonishing. So I had that idea. And amazingly, there were a few foundations that were supportive of the idea. Most of them actually, the first one was based in Israel, in Karkur. But later on, I received help from many, many wonderful environmental and just general Jewish philanthropies who cared about Israel's environment. And of course, we had membership fees. And we started hiring young lawyers. I think I started the organization, I was 29. And all of us were later in our late 30s, the board. And we just basically looked for anything that polluted or created bad environmental policy and moved, and we used the courts. And over the years, the Israeli Supreme Court, the district courts, showed incredible openness to the legal agenda. And the laws changed. Many of the laws were written by Adam Teva V'din, the air quality law, the coastal law. And so in a sense, even though we were very disadvantaged in terms of starting off in a country that prioritized development and needed to create, employment opportunities for people, we did have tremendous support, and we have a long case law in Israel which support the public's desire to preserve its natural resources.
Now, given that there is a political will, as you say, or at least awareness as to the importance of the environmental agenda, on a policy level, what would you say are the main challenges Israel is facing?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because although I do care a lot about these issues, have been very active in civil society, I do work for Tel Aviv University, and for the last 30 years have been an academic. I frequently refer to myself as an activist trapped in the body of an academic. But there's no reason why the academia, Tel Aviv University in particular, shouldn't be a leader in this area. And in fact, we are. Anybody who visits Tel Aviv University will immediately be struck by the fact that the National Museum for Natural History is based at Tel Aviv University. We have some of the world's leading researchers, people in the area of climate, people in the area of biodiversity. It's an interesting thing. One of the first faculty members of this university, Heinrich Mendelsohn, was the founder of ecology and the founder of the Society of Protection of Nature in Israel, or indirectly the founder. So we have a history of a university that has both professional expertise and also a commitment. Just recently, the Israel Prize for Ecology went to Avital Gazit, who spent his career at Tel Aviv University as a scientist who studied marine systems, or mostly, I would say, stream restoration. But he was much more than just a researcher who put out a lot of important publications and was internationally renowned. He was at every juncture when there was battles over restoration, his voice was heard. And so there's much that can be done. And in the policy realm, I think that's exactly what we need to do. First of all, we have to be willing to take stands which are unpopular. It has been clear to me now for some 20 years that even if we do everything right in the environment, if this country continues to grow at 2% a year, we will not be able to really provide the environmental quality we need for our future. I mean, in 1950, Israel had 1 million people. In 1960, 2 million people. In 1970, 3 million people. You mentioned 10.2 million today. And so that means we're going to have 20 million people. And at some point, quantity of life begins to affect quality of life. I've been talking about this for quite some time. I've started organizations. I've written a book about it. In fact, the organization Safuf, which means crowded, we call it the Forum for Israel Population, Society, Environment, was founded on this kibbutz at the Porter's School for the Environment. So there is a connection, and I'm very glad that although this is an issue which is sensitive, but Israel has to start thinking, do we really want to make maximum population growth a policy imperative as it has been since the start? There's no question. In the 1950s, Israel was an empty country. There was questions about Israel's sovereignty over our own land of Israel. We needed to grow quickly. We needed to create demographic facts across the area from Kiryat Shmona to Eilat. But today, when Israel is the most crowded country in the West, and we know that by 2050, the only country in the world which will be more crowded than Israel is Bangladesh. Is this really the future we want for our Jewish state? I'm not so sure it is. At least we need to start talking about it. I talked about it a lot in the Knesset. I got heat for it. But I think when I would sit down and literally force people to discuss the issue and say, listen, do you really want 30, 40 million people here? Is that the future you seek for your kids? The traffic jams, the crowded classrooms, the hospitals, which are the quality of service, all these areas we seek the problems, and of course the environment, loss of open spaces, carbon footprints. So these are issues which we need to discuss. And I make all these points because I'm very, very grateful to the president of Tel Aviv University, who is supporting us in the social sciences to create a new center for population and the environment. I have a close colleague there, Itzik Sasson, who is a demographer, and I'm sort of the sustainability guy. And we hope to create a world center that will discuss this issue and challenge not just for Israel, but for the planet. There's already, we know that the world's population is going to get to over 10 billion people by the end of the century. You know, Africa was 200 million people in 1950. It's going to be 4 billion people by the end of the century. This is a continent that can't feed itself, that is very violent, and it's going to get more and more crowded. So these are issues which the Israeli academia could and should be leading in terms of finding solutions, understanding what it is in psychology that leads to responsible family planning. How do we adapt? Maybe we need to make islands out of Israel to help respond to the crowded conditions. And I believe that Tel Aviv University will be a leader in this area.
There's you mentioned the fact that by 2050, global population is projected to surpass the 10 billion mark, but also 75% of the people are going to live in big cities, which brings the issue of urbanism and urbanization and the environment. What do you think Israel should do about that? Ben Gurion used to say, I don't believe in big cities. That's why I think people should settle in smaller communities in the Negev. Is that the solution?
No, I think that Ben Gurion had wonderful visions, but he was dealing with a country that had 1 million people or 2 million people when he finished his career. Now we're at 10 million people. It's a completely different challenge. And I believe as somebody who was so intellectually nimble, he would have made that transition. I can tell you what I've personally been doing in the last few weeks. When I got out of the Knesset, it turned out I had a surfeit of sabbatical time, and I've spent about half of the last 3 years at Stanford University going back and forth between Tel Aviv. And we just completed last week, I think, an extraordinary conference, which was co-sponsored by Tel Aviv University. 10 faculty members and doctoral students from Tel Aviv came over and gave lectures at Stanford. And we called the conference Climate Resilience, Urban Policies, Lessons from Los Angeles and Tel Aviv. Because after the Los Angeles fires, the whole world, including Israel, was appalled. How could this center of the entertainment industry, this one of the world's leading centers for many, many issues, including the environment, certainly the world leader in addressing air pollution, how could this kind of a disaster, 16,000 buildings destroyed, 29 people burned and dead, what could they do differently? And Tel Aviv also has been there, but Tel Aviv has been, I think, ahead of the curve for the last 15 years about thinking about adaptation. What can we do? And we know the things that we need to do in theory, but how do you translate that to policies? I'm talking about planting trees, creating a infrastructure which will allow you to both accept them greater and more tense storms and prevent the flooding. We had people die in Tel Aviv because of flooding. The wonderful couple was stuck in an elevator and they couldn't get out on the bottom floor. So we've seen our own tragedies. What about the sea level rise? We're going to be seeing a foot level, 2 foot level. If you know Tel Aviv, you don't want to be investing in the Yarkon Street unless we do something. So there are a lot of areas where we can and should be doing better. We know that the heat level just this year, the merry month of May, we just completed, and Israel broke its record. We had, I guess you could say, 113 degrees Fahrenheit. But look at the region. That's where we're going. In Dubai, they had 51 degrees in May. We're talking about 125 degrees, Death Valley levels. Last year, in the area of when the Muslim world went on their Hajj, to the pilgrimage to Mecca, 1,300 people didn't find hotel rooms and died of heat exposure. These are challenges for our cities in Israel today that we have to start thinking about as we prepare for a new climatic reality. So while we have to do everything we can to reduce our emissions and try to stabilize global greenhouse gases, it's coming, ready or not, and we're not ready. And so I think a city like Tel Aviv, which is innovative, that has a mayor who cares and is connected. This year, my students in the Tel Aviv University Public Policy Department worked with the city, and we evaluated their sustainability projects with the chairman of their environmental committee as we work together with academia to inform the cities, how can you be ready for the climate crisis?
Now, I saw in your biography that you were very active working with Palestinians on developing joint programs. Tell us a little bit more, educate us about what is happening on the regional scale to tackle issues of the environment together, setting aside the national and the military conflicts.
Well, there's a fascinating history of the past 30-some years since the Oslo Accords, but on the overall evaluation of how we've done, I think it's pretty poorly. Now, the great disappointment. We hoped, the environmental community, and I was just starting off then, that the environment would offer, or the peace process would offer environmental dividends, that we could leverage the desire in the region to create a more conciliatory place to let the environment lead the way. Because if we're looking for common denominators, everybody in the region wants to turn on their water and drink it and not get sick and have their kids go to school and breathe the air and not get asthma. And so there was a lot of even provisions in those initial agreements, but very, very low implementation. There was initial projects started, but I don't want to get too political, but the long regime of Netanyahu as the prime minister have not been good for relations with our neighbors. The peace with Jordan became cold and basically dormant for many years. The good news is, when there was the so-called government of change, and I'm proud to have been part of that, the pendulum swung back unbelievably quickly. So Naftali Bennett, who himself is quite right-wing, it's not a right-left issue, I think it's a personality issue. Immediately, the king of Jordan opened the door. We created what's called Project Prosperity, and the Minister of Regional Cooperation signed an agreement where we will be giving water to Jordan, and they'll be sending us clean energy. Israel doesn't have much space for solar energy, and therefore we're stuck at 12% renewables, which is a disgrace. And the Palestinians and the Jordanians in particular, well, Jordan's probably the most water-scarce country in the world after taking in 2 million Syrian refugees. We can give them very inexpensive desalinized water. So this kind of a cooperative agreement has been signed. Unfortunately, nothing much is happening. But I believe this is not for shortage of ideas, but for shortage of trust in the region. And I believe that as the electoral tides are going to change, we will be able to redo this because it doesn't make sense. Israel ecologically is no bigger than a postage stamp. There's no way we're going to solve our stream water pollution problems that Palestinians don't treat their sewage, and their air quality won't be good unless we get our act together in terms of our emissions from cars. So these are the kinds of issues which we should talk about together, and we could, and we have partners on the other side.
That's a very optimistic view. We usually end our podcast, and we're running out of time, and I wish I had more time because it's a fascinating conversation. We usually end with a question about your specific plans for the future in the School of Public Policy and how the great people that are listening and watching us right now, thousands and thousands of people from all over the world, how can they be of help to you?
Well, like I said, I'm delighted that institutionally we have a general commitment at Tel Aviv University, both at the Dean of Social Sciences level and the President, to create a new center here for population and sustainability. To talk about, okay, we're going to grow, we're going to be 20 million people. How do we do it in a way which is creative? Where are we going to put the next airfield and the air infrastructure for having an airport in the country? So many things. Every house in Israel is going to have to be doubled. Every shopping mall, every road. We go from 10 to 20 million people. And that's demography, what's called momentum. Because the young kids in Israel haven't had children yet, and they're going to. And we're getting older, the population. These are challenges we need to think about, and nobody is thinking in the long term. So anybody's interested in this particular challenge, how are we going to be prepared for a future and give our children a sustainable society 20, 30 years when there's 20 million Israelis here, should be in touch with me directly, Alon Tal at tau.acil. I'm easy to find, or anybody else who works in this field, because this is an area where Tel Aviv should be leading the way and could be leading the way. We have the people, and if we have more resources, we'll be more influential. So I'm very passionate about this issue. There's many faculty members who are with us on this quest to make Israel maybe a crowded country, but one that's going to be a great quality of life, and you can be part of these solutions and thinking about this creatively.
Professor Alon Tal, it's been a pleasure and a privilege to host you here in our little studio, and I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank you for your leadership and your passion and your enthusiasm, which is contagious. I'm sure that our audience will agree. Thank you so much.
And thank you for bringing the good word from Tel Aviv to the world. We need your support, and we're grateful for it.
Yeah, that's the purpose of this podcast. And to our viewers and listeners back home from Tel Aviv, goodbye until the next episode.